So I don't usually do quarterback rankings, but with the crazy injuries happening at the position in the last couple of weeks, I figured it's time to reset and reestablish a tentative order here ahead of week 10. Let's get into it. We can start with the obvious here at number 1, Josh Allen against Denver this week. Allen has accounted for multiple touchdowns in 8 straight weeks now. The one exception was week 1 this season, but this is somebody who's undeniably one of the best fantasy quarterbacks in today's game and last year's game and in the year before that and the future, really. Not only do we have somebody who is top 5 in the league in passing attempts, passing yards, and passing touchdowns, but Josh Allen brings a rushing element as well, which is very enticing in most point formats. He's had at least 6 rushing touchdowns in every year of his career, and halfway through, he's already hit that mark here. Week in, week out, I'm riding with Allen. Let's keep it simple here. Joe Burrow's number 2. Gone are the days where we are worried about Joe Burrow throwing for 200 yards and or getting in the end zone. He is 100% healthy, and this Bengals offense in general is about as healthy as they have been all year, knock on wood. Since he is the second most pass-heavy offense in the NFL at the moment, Burrow has made Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, and even Joe Mixon prevalent receivers in the fantasy world. Houston, his opposition for this week, is bottom 10 in the league in passing yards allowed. Justin Herbert's up next. He may only have 9 fingers.
What?
But he's battling through and showing out as one of the top fantasy quarterback options week in, week out, based on sheer volume through the air. Herbert has had a ton of injuries unfolding around him. We've got Eckler going down at one point. He's back now, thank goodness. Mike Williams is out for the season, and now Joshua Palmer is taking a visit to the IR. While Herbert was relatively quiet against a tough Jets defense, he now faces a Lions team that's in the bottom half of the league in terms of passing touchdowns allowed per game at 1.4. I'd keep an eye on this Chargers-Lions game in general, considering it does have the highest projected total of this week at 48.5, and Vegas knows their stuff, all right? They're doing the same research I am, if not more. Speaking of keeping an eye on this matchup, let's flip to the other side of it and give Jared Goff his flowers heading into a very favorable matchup against this Chargers defense. The Lions have shown more of a commitment to the run this year, first feeding David Montgomery, and then finally getting Jahmyr Gibbs involved, but Gibbs has been more involved in the passing game than Montgomery was, therefore helping Jared Goff's fantasy value up just a little bit. Goff has cleared 35 passing attempts 3 games in a row, and now he has a date with what I'm going to call the worst secondary in the league at the moment. The Chargers are giving up a league-high 286 passing yards per game. Jared Goff should have a phenomenal week. Lamar Jackson has been nothing short of dynamic so far. I think it'd honestly be ignorant to leave this guy out of the MVP conversation in 2023, considering the Ravens' success and the numbers that Jackson has put up, both through the air and on the ground. With that considered, AFC North games are ugly, and Cleveland's defense is definitely dominant, to say the very least. The Browns all but eliminate every passing attack they've faced so far, allowing a league-low 145 passing yards per game. But Lamar Jackson has tucked it and ran an average of 9 times per game. He's leaning more on good old reliable in Mark Andrews through the air as of late, reverting back to old habits. But this is a running football team at heart, and Lamar Jackson is at the heart of it. They run it more than anybody else. Brock Purdy's up next, and honestly, he's one of the most consistent fantasy options in the league. We talked about that in our Week 10 buys video, as he's one of those 9 options. Brock Purdy has scored within a couple of points of his projected total in all but 1 week so far. This is a Niners team in general that has been a little bruised up with Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, all being bruised up at some point in some way, shape, or form in the first couple of months. Now they're presumably more fresh coming off of a bye week. Purdy is 27th in the NFL in sacks taken because that offensive line and his decisiveness are a glorious combination. And now Brock Purdy will face off against the Jacksonville team, allowing the 11th most amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. Great matchup here. I've got him at 6. CJ Stroud is coming off of an all-time performance. He broke the single-game passing yards record for a rookie. He passed up Andrew Luck, so an AFC South foe. 470 passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns against the Buccaneers. Is that a testament to Stroud's talent or the Buccaneers' lack of a secondary? I would say it's a combination of both, to be honest with you. This team has all of the trust in the world in CJ Stroud right now. He's 6th in the NFL in total air yards, so we are seeing him take shots down the field constantly. Since he is favored by a touchdown in this matchup against Houston, if Houston works from behind, that's all the more reason for CJ Stroud to throw it more. Dak Prescott gets a lot of hate, but with so many quarterback injuries across the board in the NFL right now, we can't put him at any lower than at number 8 overall here, in my opinion, especially this week. The Giants don't allow a whole lot of passing yards per game. It's only 211, but keep in mind, they've just lost so many games this year that the team they're going up against gets up big and starts running out the clock. Dak went off for 394 passing yards against the Eagles secondary in a loss, a very razor-thin loss last week, and that's no easy feat, throwing 400 against the Eagles. If this game turns into a blowout, we just need to hope that Dak scores early and often through the air. Otherwise, it's going to be Tony Pollard time. We've talked about the importance of passing volume with the Sam Howell situation in Washington, and that point is only growing by the week. The Commanders now officially have the most lopsided run-pass ratio in the league. They are throwing the ball a league-high 68% of the time and running it just 32% of the time. The pressure from Washington's defense being applied on Howell, considering they are allowing 27.2 points per game, that's the third highest rate in the league, pushes this offense into a panicked and pass-heavy scheme. And 4 different receivers have at least 40 targets so far. Why do I mention that? That gives us security. If one person like Curtis Samuel or Jahan Dotson or Logan Thomas goes down, the other 3 are ones that Howell can and has relied on. Geno Smith is up next. He's facing a Commanders team allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I've talked before about how Geno Smith has definitely taken a step back this year compared to his big resurgence story last year, seeing significant drops in categories like passing touchdowns per game, yards per attempt, and in turn fantasy points as well, unfortunately. But a matchup with the Commanders defense, especially with Metcalf, Lockett, and JSN all healthy and at Geno Smith's disposal, yeah, that's a tough bid to turn down, and that's why I have Geno sneaking into my top 10 overall here. Trevor Lawrence and this Jaguars offense are coming off of a bye week. Now, Lawrence maybe hasn't given his fantasy owners, I would know being one of them, I was a big Trevor Lawrence buyer this year. He hasn't given us the fireworks we've been looking for. He's only had 9 total touchdowns in 8 games up to this point, but he hasn't played poorly either by any means. Trevor Lawrence has a completion percentage north of 68%, and he averages around the ballpark of 270 yards of offense per game. So through the air and on the ground, he's pretty involved as a rusher too. He's already cleared 200 rushing yards on the ground at the halfway point of the season. This matchup for Lawrence against a 49ers team, it's not easy by any means. They have allowed the 8th least amount of fantasy points to the position. But when somebody with Lawrence's arm talent has receivers like Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, Evan Ingram, and someone who's developing as a receiving back in Travis Etienne, it's hard to vote against him. Kyler Murray has the potential to flip some fantasy teams around, but we need to temper our expectations just a little bit before I call him the savior of your season. I'll say the exact same thing I said about Calvin Ridley and other players in this situation. Kyler has not played an NFL game in a while, just about 11 months to the day to be exact. What do I know about Kyler? It's the duality of his game. He is averaging over 500 rushing yards per season, even with some abbreviated seasons in there. And in 2020, he was the QB3 overall in fantasy. Granted, that is when he had DeAndre Hopkins, a prime DeAndre Hopkins to throw to. But quarterbacks with that rushing upside give us that extra bonus over a traditional pocket passer. That's one of the reasons Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts have dominated the fantasy world for the last couple of years. If we can get anything close to that level of play from Kyler that we saw a couple of years ago, even though he doesn't have the best of supporting casts right now relative to what he had before, I'm satisfied. Will Levis went from third stringer to starting QB in under a month, with Matt Vrabel officially naming Levis the QB1 ahead of this week. The pressure's off of him, right? The job is his. As for what he's done so far, the guy's not afraid to chuck it deep. Just look at the film. He was airing the ball out to DeAndre Hopkins in his first couple of series in the NFL, and the Titans playbook has seemingly opened up for Will Levis. His opposition this week, it's that Tampa Bay team we just talked about that got torched by CJ Stroud. I expect Will Levis to have plenty of opportunities to excel in this week's matchup. Baker Mayfield's up next and takes on a Tennessee team that has a middle-of-the-back passing defense when it comes to yards given up through the air. Mayfield has shown promising signs of being a reliable, low-end QB1 around fantasy, especially in the last couple of weeks. He has tossed multiple touchdowns in back-to-back weeks, has one of the most underrated 1-2 punches in the league at his disposal in Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and he's been getting Cade Otton involved more and more in high percentage throw situations. Say what you will about the Broncos, say what you will about Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson has made some serious strides from last year. Granted, the bar wasn't set very high, but Wilson has already matched his passing touchdown total from last season. In just 8 games this year, he's averaging 2 per contest, so 16 total. Russell Wilson has cleared 15 fantasy points in 6 of 8 contests and is coming off of a victory against the Chiefs after Denver failed to defeat them for years. Facing Buffalo this week is not going to be a walk in the park by any means, considering they do allow the 3rd least amount of fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, but Denver's a 7.5 point underdog, so at the very least, the Broncos may be throwing the ball a lot if they end up struggling and get down on the scoreboard early. Jordan Love comes in at number 16 and is slowly starting to figure things out, I think. All major components of Love's running back and receiving core are relatively healthy, so he should be performing at or near his peak at this point. Christian Watson was out for the first few weeks, and Aaron Jones wasn't truly back until he got north of 20 touches and was off what seemed to be a snap count limit going into last week's game. Pittsburgh allows the 8th most amount of passing yards in the league so far, and I expect Love to throw the ball a lot considering that the Steelers are favored in this game. Vegas is giving Pittsburgh 3.5 points at home. Derek Carr is up next and did what most quarterbacks do against Chicago when he played them last week. He threw multiple touchdowns and protected the ball. Carr's fantasy value, in my opinion, is going to heavily depend on the relationship he can establish with his wide receiver 1 in Chris Olave. The touchdown pass to him and looks around the end zone in general for him last week, that's definitely a start. Carr has cleared 15 fantasy points in each of his last 4 performances, but he still hasn't cleared 20 in any game this year, so definitely a clear ceiling for Derek Carr so far. Even against this blitz-heavy Minnesota Vikings defense this week that gives a lot of opportunity up down the field, I'm not thrilled about Derek Carr compared to the rest of this list. Joshua Dobbs is a name that's going to go down in history for what he did last week. He was signed in the middle of the week by the Vikings with Kirk Cousins obviously going down with a season-ending injury. Joshua Dobbs was not supposed to start because he hardly had time to learn the playbook or get reps. The backup in Minnesota goes down with a concussion. Dobbs comes in and takes down the Falcons in dramatic fashion. It only gets better for him from here, by the way. He has one of the easiest remaining schedules from a fantasy perspective. The best receiver in football in Justin Jefferson is set to come back in the coming weeks. Because of his gutsy performance, I don't really see Minnesota tapering back in the pass and playing scared. Jordan Addison looks great. I have Dobbs here at number 18 overall against the Saints. We saw Gardner Minshew let loose a couple of weeks ago when he took over for Anthony Richardson, but he's kind of dialed it back now in terms of throwing volume. From 55 passing attempts in week 6 to just 26 last week. Some of this is dependent on game script, but most of it, I would argue, is dependent on availability and production of those key pieces in the backfield. Zach Moss has been a beast of a backup, averaging in the mid-4s, 4 yards per carry, and Jonathan Taylor has worked his way back into his usual role. We're north of a month since he came back. The Patriots, his opposition for this week, allow north of 230 passing yards per game. That's bottom 12 in the league, and the projected total for this one sits around a modest 43 points. Let's stay in this matchup. I feel like we have a lot of pairs this week. Mac Jones against Indianapolis. I don't have many positive things to say about this Patriots offense. After throwing for over 300 yards and adding on 3 passing touchdowns in the first week under Bill O'Brien's offense, Mac Jones has failed to do either of those things in any game since. New England has inhabited a pass-heavy scheme regardless of whether they've wanted to or not because they've lost so many games and been behind for so many minutes this year. Against the Colts secondary this week, Mac Jones is going to see his chances, but you can only be so optimistic about an offense in New England that's scoring 15 points per game. Yikes. Deshaun Watson had a much-needed bounce-back week against the Cardinals in Week 9, with Clayton Tune out there and a bruised-up backfield as well. Arizona couldn't really hold on to the ball and sustain a lot of prolonged drives, so that gave Deshaun Watson and the Browns offense plenty of opportunities. But Baltimore is their opposition this week, and they are a completely different animal. Baltimore is allowing just 170 passing yards per game, and the Ravens are also allowing a league-low 13.8 points to offenses per contest as well. Bryce Young has had the advantage all year of being on a losing football team. Yeah, that's a really weird statement, right? But fantasy-wise, it makes sense. His team has worked from behind more than the majority of the league. So game script-wise, Carolina has had to be very throw-heavy, and the numbers support it. They throw the ball 63.5% of the time, but I do have Young all the way back down here due to a lack of production on offense considering that throw-heavy scheme. Still makes the list, just barely though. He's averaging south of 200 passing yards per game and has 8 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. Outside of Tremaine Edmonds being out for this game, the Chicago defense is pretty healthy. We'll have to see. I'm not really impressed what I've seen so far from Young. He's definitely improving though. Tyson Bagent has definitely made his fair share of mistakes. Just look at the game against the Saints last week, but he has been able to move the ball down the field for the most part. The biggest part of his game to focus on is release time. Bagent is spending less time in the pocket, and as a result, he's been sacked 5 times in 4 games, while Fields has been sacked 24 times in 6 games. That ends the offensive line debate in Chicago. We saw a bit of a rushing element added to the mix last week as well, as Bagent tucked it and ran 8 times for 70 yards. Super efficient. Taylor Heinicke will round out our top 24 list. It looks to be Heinicke's job over Ritter's, at least for the short-term future in Atlanta, and he had a decent performance against the Vikings last week. 268 passing yards and 1 touchdown and 1 interception. It's not a groundbreaking stat line, but it's definitely serviceable at the quarterback position, considering the market out there where everybody is dropping like flies, apparently. 14 of his 59 passes so far have been graded as poor by fantasy pros. That's a rate of nearly 25% for poor throws. That's not optimal, but it is early. That's a pretty small sample size. We'll see what Heinicke can do as he adjusts to this run-heavy Atlanta offense that I expect to be pretty active this week against the 1-8 Arizona Cardinals. Thank you for watching. As always, feel free to leave any fantasy football related questions in the comment section below. Like and subscribe if you appreciate the content we're cranking out heading into week 10, and we will see you in the next video.